Okay, so now I'll start talking about the paper. So Andy's one request was present something on Bangladesh, which I'm happy to do, because at least half my work is there. And so I'm going to talk about, I gave a menu of papers and you guys chose this. So I'll talk about this program on international migration. So it's a really important part of our economy, Bangladesh economy, as it is for much of South Asia. And but the paper is going to be extremely simple. Okay, so it's simple in the sense that there was an international migration opportunity. The government ran a lottery, right? And my job was to like track down people who participate in the lottery, right? And I can just give you treatment effects. There is a couple of tweaks here and there. It won't take me. It's not too complicated to explain. So we'll have a really easy talk today. If there's a problem. Oh, and so the paper is co-authored with Ifat Sharif and Mahesh Srishta, who are both at the World Bank. So international migration is very common. About 3% of the world's population live outside their country of birth. And then, one quick thing for the, especially graduate students who are interested in, migration research, that there's many different types of migration. So when we think about like estimating our returns to migration, that phrase itself isn't necessarily sensible, right? Because migration can be permanent, right? You go and you have or it can be like you go initially on a temporary visa, but you have a path to citizenship, right? So who would migrate under those conditions? Who is let in? How long they would stay? How they would behave with respect to remitting money back may be very different than if you're going to a country where they're giving you a work visa, but there is no path to migration. So imagine Bangladesh is going to Dubai or Qatar is very different from Bangladesh is traveling to the US or UK or even Italy, right? Which is somewhere in between. So now of these many different types of migration, a lot of the people who are migrants are temporary workers, and a lot of them are South Asians living in richer parts of Asia, and both in the Middle East, but as well as in East Asia. So countries like Singapore, Malaysia, and increasingly Korea now, right, are big hosts of migrants, and traditionally, of course, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, etc. have been big hosts, and it also extended beyond the Gulf. Like Libya used to be a big host, like any oil-rich country used to be. And so international remittances exceed 620 billion. So just to put that in perspective, it's more than all official development assistance around the world, and much larger than FDI, and it would easily surpass any reasonable estimate of the gains from trade. Okay, so this is a really important financial flow. And during the COVID period, we've also been collecting data, including following the same sample. And you do see that migrants have experienced this crisis, or migrant families have experienced this crisis very differently. That's another reason we might want to think carefully about it. And this is important for the sending countries. So in several Central Asian countries, the numbers are pretty stunning, that it goes up to 40, 45, 48% in some years, like the percentage of, so remittances over GDP, the remittance GDP ratio. So it's in Kyrgyzstan, in Tajikistan, it's always above 25%. In Nepal, Qatar is a big corridor. In Bangladesh, historically, it's averaged about 10% of our GDP. It's now the country is growing a lot, and it's growing in other sectors like the ready-made garment industry. So it's now come down to between 5 and 8%, depending on year. And so those are just a basic set of facts. And then there's been some macro data-based estimates of the returns from migration, and they suggest that the income gains, the potential income gains, are several multiples of home income, right? So Michael Clemens has a very well-cited paper called $1 billion or $1 trillion bills left on the sidewalk. It's either billion or trillion, but it's a large number. Just saying that, look, people, if we were to just allow them to be physically located where they would be more productive, the global GDP would grow by trillions. Okay, and so now I want to have the second slide is about trying to make the case for why this particular migration corridor that I'm studying is important. Okay, so the first slide was about why migration in general, international migration in general, is important. So it turns out that most international migrants, in spite of the types of things that get covered in the media often, right? Most international migrants travel along south-south corridors. So it's not that we keep hearing about, the invasion of migrants into Europe and how that's changing politics and everything, but it's a small trickle compared to what the Middle East hosts, right? US, Canada, etc. By the way, this is one general issue and a pet peeve. So Andy and I were at a refugee event in Copenhagen recently, and one slide I really liked that Sandra Rosso was presenting, I think it was your joint paper, was like, who are the refugee hosting nations in the world, right? None of the rich countries are anywhere on the list. Like they're a trickle compared to, say, countries like Lebanon or Pakistan, right? Lebanon's like 20% of the population is refugees, right? Whereas what we hear about in the news media is always about whether the US should take 3 people or 4 people. Yeah. And that like eats up all the oxygen in the international media.
Pakistan won't be more than 5%, right?
Yeah. So as a percentage, I mean, Pakistan is a very large country.
But it's a very large country, 20 million. So maybe 5 or 6 million from Afghanistan.
Exactly. Right. Pakistan is a big host. Bangladesh. So Bangladesh is also a large country, but just between 2017 and 2019, there was an influx of over 1 million
from Burma.
From Myanmar, the Rohingyas who are coming from Rakhine State. Yeah. And then another example, Kenya is hosting many refugees from many different countries. Like they're coming from the north, from South Sudan, right? But they're also coming from Congo, right? So there's lots of African countries that host many refugees too. Okay, but that's refugees. But we're going to talk about economic migrants today. So very different population.
When you say those numbers, are you? I mean, sometimes those are underestimated because not everybody who semantics refugees have the right master refugee fact.
Yeah, and in fact, no. So these are, I would say, like the numbers I was just citing, like the Bangladesh number, for example. That's the official number after the Rohingya started getting registered, right? But reasonable estimates are that there's twice as many, right? Just because they have been crossing the border. It's just that they've been crossing the border steadily to a trickle. Okay, so maybe I'll come back and talk about the Rohingya a little bit because I just won't do it right now because then we'll go off track. And yeah, it's also the case that there's been a period where we weren't recognizing the fact that the Rohingyas were coming in, but now we do, and that's why we have numbers. Okay, so of the 300, like roughly 270 million migrants in the world, more than 30 million are South Asians that live in another country in Asia, but outside their country of birth. Right? So as I said, Middle East and East Asia are important destinations, but like I'm cheating here a little bit, but because it's also the case that there are Indians living in Bangladesh, there are Bangladeshis living in India, right? That would also count here.
Are those numbers large since this is an economic style seminar now? So you don't mind these?
No, I don't mind at all.
So is there a good estimate of number of Bangladeshis in India and number of Indians in Bangladesh?
Yeah, so there is actually a migration database that you can, like bilateral migration database that you can download, and you'll get these numbers. Now, of course, the Indian government would claim that those numbers are meaningless. Because I mean, their claim is that there is a lot of unregistered illegal border crossings.
That is correct. I mean, it has shaped Indian politics very seriously in the last 3 years. The issue,
including in West Bengal.
Because they're not seen in the those who don't follow that. In the language of Delhi's rulers, they are not Bengali; they are Muslim. That's the issue.
Yeah.
Right. This is how politics gets shaped.
And in Assam, I mean, it's been an issue in Assam as well, where unfortunately, after, I guess, NRC-CAA combination, they, like a lot of people who were caught in the trap turned out to be non-Muslims, right?
That's correct.
So now you have to figure out how to undo that.
That is correct,
yeah. Oh, okay. So I am gonna I'm gonna start now I'm gonna stick much more to my paper, because one other thing that happened is, I've had to do a lot of work in India over the past few months because of the masks. We're distributing masks in India. Oh, because we talked about this last month.
A month ago,
yeah. And with the Indian interaction, and exactly this conversation that we're having right now led to thousands of I guess Modi followers or Hindu followers or Hindutva followers who who went after me and then wrote many letters to the Yale president and the board of trustees on this jihadi who's a threat to Hindu students at Yale and needs to be kicked out. So anyways,
this is standard stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Mushfiq standard.
So maybe that's better for a dinner conversation.
Yeah. We will. Brown's president gets letters to fire me. So
Okay, all right.
Brown should fire me.
Okay, then we need to have a drink together.
So these are equal opportunity guys.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'm sorry, but I'm also happy to hear that. Okay, so now from countries like Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Pakistan, there's over 2 million migrants who are getting work permits to work abroad every year. And these are, okay, so when I was saying there's many different types of migration, right? It's also the type of work permit this is. Like doctors and engineers get work permits to work abroad, but so do, say, gardeners, cooks, household help, etc. Right? So the majority here, the majority workers that I'm talking about here are going to be on temporary contracts. So there's no path to permanent residency in the country that they're going to. Right? And it's contractual work. So typically it's like you sign a contract with an employer. Typically it would have like a 2-year duration, but it is, you can redo the contracts after 2 years if the employer likes you. And it's typically for very low skilled work. Okay, and that's the type of population we'll look at today. Yeah.
Suresh, I was a school paper on the UAE of how when the laws of time workers to
yeah,
how that affects them.
Exactly.
How's it in this context?
Yeah. So it's not as bad. So that's the, I think it's kafala system or kafala, I think. Yeah. So yeah, so that paper shows, so it's Suresh Naidu, Xingyi Wang, and a third author whose name I'm forgetting. Sorry? Oh, yeah, Nyarko, yeah. So that paper shows that their employers exercise monopsony power, so they're able to extract a lot from the workers. Now, I'm not sure if I have slides on this. I can't remember if I have it for the short talk, but we can look at, in the paper we look at sort of the conditions of migrants, right? Relative to, in Malaysia, relative to the conditions of migrants, because I have them in the sample as well, because from the control group, people migrate and they often migrate to other locations, right? So we can look at their living conditions those who are going to Malaysia versus elsewhere, right? So what we'll see is that that's going to be non-experimental, right? Unlike most of the paper, because we're now looking at the subset of people who've chosen to migrate. Okay? And so what you'll see is that those working conditions in Malaysia on these contracts are actually a lot better than they are for the other control group migrants that are going to the Middle East. Okay. Now, so one way to interpret that might be that the destinations are different and they treat workers differently, but I don't think that's the only interpretation. Another thing is that the particular program that we'll discuss today, a government-to-government intermediate program, that might lead to a separate type of working conditions than. So one thing I want to be, I should be clear about that already came up, is that when I'm estimating the returns to migration here, what I'm estimating is the returns to migration of this particular type, but also for a specific program, right? So which is a government-to-government intermediate program. And I think that's of independent interest. So whether or not government intermediation can improve migrant outcomes, right? But it's not like I can give you a separate estimate for what's government intermediated versus not. All right. So anyway.
What is GCC?
Gulf Cooperation Council. So basically, think about the
UAE,
Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait.
Not
Bahrain.
Iran. Not Iran. That's not a Gulf.
No. Yeah. And not maybe Oman, not Yemen.
Yeah, and not Iraq either.
Not Iraq, exactly. So those countries in the Persian Gulf or maybe they'll say Arabian Gulf. They're like really large hosts for South Asians, right? So with all these numbers, I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you, but the point is that this particular corridor that we're going to look at today, which is Bangladesh is moving to Malaysia, happens to be a really important one, right? And I'm making this point because we do have some existing estimates of returns to migration, right? but they're often for like the best estimates that we currently have are often for the types of migration that's not really representative, and that's not that important in the global scheme of things. So for example, we have the best estimates for Tongans living in New Zealand. and you know, like, and it's a program of like that takes 300 people, but 300 people may be a substantial fraction of the Tongan population. I'm not sure, but it's still really small. And this is just very different. So like we'll get numbers that could be very different or it could be similar, and it'll be interesting to see which one. So now the corridor we're talking about is Bangladesh is moving to Malaysia. Okay. And I'm making the case that it's represented. Now, what do we know about this? So there hasn't been any rigorous evaluations of this type of movement, right? So what you have are news stories, and they're often dominated by really like sensational, but possibly rare events, right? So what comes up in the news stories often is stories of worker abuse, often that happens in richer countries in Asia and often happens in the Gulf countries. Yeah. So that comes from, and that's much more related to the paper you were mentioning, right? That comes from the fact that, you know, especially in the Middle East, people are going on contracts where their passports are taken away. So automatically you become beholden to an employer. You cannot easily change employers. So you're beholden to a particular person who's giving you the contract. Otherwise you'd have to leave, right? And so as a result, and people, you know, there might be domestic helpers who, you know, without a passport, without an ability to move around freely, they might be particularly dependent on their employer and subject to more abuse. So that is important, and we collect data on it as well. Like we collect information on, in this particular case, it's not so much domestic abuse, but it could be that you have unsafe working conditions, right? So we try to collect systematic data on that as well. But what's important about the paper is that it's important not for us to not only look at those events, especially if they happen to be rare, but also look at the upside, because providing work permits to millions of South Asians may also be important for the development trajectories of these countries. Right? And by the way, so this is not really something that's coming out of the paper, but something I've been thinking about as we do research on this, is that part of the reason, like the UAE, for example, okay, has, I think, something like 87% of its population are migrant workers, right? And, you know, so in the US, the politics, you know, even like say Canada, take the most liberal location, the politics of no country in the world, right? Like in the Western world, would ever allow a situation where 87% of the population is foreign born, right? The US is an immigrant country, but I think in the 1920s, we may have peaked at what, 15%, something like that. Okay. So why does that happen? I think part of the reason is that precisely for the type of migration. So there are, you know, you're allowing your country to be flooded by migrant workers, as long as the locals know that these guys are never going to become Emirati and start voting, right? And so that might allow you to just host a lot more. So then there's a really interesting question that I'm not answering here, right? The interesting question is why, you know, is it better for us to have the US style immigration policy or Canadian style immigration policy or Australian, right? Where you bring people in and they have a path to becoming an Australian at some point, right? Or, but then at that point, if you opt for that, then the politics are such that you can only let it trickle in, right? Whereas, are we going to make more of a contribution to international development if we were to essentially treat migrants worse just by saying that, look, there is a deadline here, you pass some date, or pass some age, your work permit is not going to get renewed, right? But at the same time, you know, you're contributing a lot more through remittances back in the home country.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
If it's going too far away from economics, just stop. But the one in the political economy literature, traditional, conventional political economy literature,
yeah.
The distinction was drawn between labor as simply a factor of production and labor as a factor of production with the body of rights. With the body of rights. Yeah. Because labor is the only factor of production which has a body, and feelings and emotions, and culture. So in the older political economy literature, the argument was that the migration to United States or Canada or Australia is about not just a factor of production, but a factor of production with which is attached a body of rights,
Right.
and a set of emotions,
Right.
and a set of cultures.
Yeah.
Whereas migration to the GCC,
Yeah.
where you can have 80% or 60%, and anyone who's been to Dubai knows that it's really maybe 90%, something like that. It's simply a factor of production.
Yeah.
And so the entire calculation is that your contract is over, go back.
Go back, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, and I wonder, okay, so imagine, I don't know the answer to this, but imagine that we do a careful, complicated model of costs and benefits, and we learn that, look, the Dubai type policy is actually better for Bangladesh than the Canada type policy, right? In that case, when we talk about body of rights, I mean, if that turns out to be true, right, that might actually be something that we're using to keep people out of countries where they should be. Like Canada has a land area, has the resources to take in a lot more people, right? And only because we're saying that it's a different factor of production, so we can apply different rules, right? So US, Canada, these countries are also not imposing that many barriers to mobility and other factors of production. Capital, financial capital, they're all moving freely. In fact, they're telling us to remove those barriers, right? And I think that's good advice. But you know, at the same time, they're putting barriers on this, the factor of production with the body. Yeah. Okay. So now, so basically, what I want to say here is that we want to do more systematic analysis of the costs and benefits. So we'll collect large sample data on that. Now, why is it that there are so many problems? Okay, and this is where I'm trying to motivate why we're looking at this particular program, a G2G, government to government intermediate program. So traditionally, what happens is private sector intermediation, and there's a lot of fraudulent activity and a lot of abuse in that sector. So these migrants, I mean, so one issue is that it's very expensive, right? It's also very risky. So there's lots and lots of cases, and Sam Bazi and others now have a project in Indonesia trying to work on improving this. There's lots and lots of cases where, you know, these guys might be promised a job or promised a set of working conditions or wages, etc., that don't get paid ultimately, or there are hidden fees saying that, look, this was actually the fee, so you have to work for free for the first year in order to pay back the fees that are owed to me, right? And so especially for poor, unskilled migrants, which is the type of population we're talking about, it's much easier for them to be taken advantage of, right? There is an asymmetry in power, resources, access to capital, risk, etc. Okay? And so it is quite risky. So about 34% of Bangladeshi migrants, this is from a survey, right, fail to find work abroad. Okay, so they go abroad, they fail to find work. And I have, I'll tell you one particular story. So I was always worked in Bangladesh. Then for a period, I was working in Malawi. And one time I was traveling between Lilongwe and Dhaka, and I thought I must be the only person who's ever done this trip, right? Turns out on that very plane, it's like I only noticed the guy after the third plane because it was like very complicated, like Lilongwe to somewhere in Congo, then to Addis to Mumbai, Mumbai to Dhaka, right? And then in Mumbai airport, I saw that this guy was on the same flights with me. So then and he looked Bangladeshi, so I went and started talking to him. And yeah, so he was sent, and this was the second time this happened to him. So one of these private sector intermediaries took $10,000 from his family. So they sold, you know, his parents sold their land, right, to pay for this trip. And they said, okay, we're going to get you into South Africa. So there are Bangladeshis who are working in like on the farm areas of South Africa, like around Bloemfontein, right? There's a lot of large farms there, and they're Bangladeshi workers there, right? And so he said, okay, I'll get you into South Africa. And the way that we'll get you into South Africa is that I'm going to send you to Malawi. Okay. And the reason why Malawi, and I've actually had to deal with this because I was traveling on a Bangladeshi passport. Malawi is one of the few countries that allow a Bangladeshi passport in because they have this, you know, thing on their website, right, that says that any Commonwealth country can come in. Okay. But then like I've actually tested it. So I actually got a visa because I was like, I'm not going to trust something that says any Commonwealth country can come in. So I got a visa, but I didn't show it to them because it wasn't like stamped on my passport. And I presented to the guy in Malawi, and he's like, no, you can't come in, right? So then I was like, what about this Commonwealth country? I don't know what that means. So then I showed the visa. So it's a little complicated. So anyway, this intermediary was trying to take advantage of that loophole. Send this guy. So this guy, he tells me the story. He comes all the way, right? He doesn't speak a word of English, right? And then somebody in, like, they're like, what are you doing? And, you know, partly not speaking English is also difficult, right? And his guy from Bangladesh said that, oh, after you get through the airport, there'll be somebody there and they'll drive you over the border. Okay? And then the guy tells me that, oh, the official there said that if I just give him $100, then he'll get me in. So that he gave this guy $100 note, and then that guy disappeared, right? And then he gets deported and he's sent all the way back. And the sad story is that this is the second time. So last time, you know, another intermediary told him that he could go to Italy, right? He got all the way to somewhere in the Middle East, right? And then got deported back on the last flight. So people are really desperate to travel. Okay? And I'll show you other data that suggests that, like, people think the returns are high enough that they are willing to take a huge risk in order to travel. Okay, so we do want to. So there are costs, there are risks, there are potentially benefits, and we want to get data on that. Okay? So now, precisely because of this, I should give you a bit of the history. Precisely because of this type of abuse and fraudulent activity, the government of Malaysia, and it was happening on both sides, both on the Malaysian side and Bangladeshi side. The government of Malaysia, it was, I think in 2009, they just banned all Bangladeshi immigration, right? No more Bangladeshis can come in. And then a couple of years later, this agreement got signed, where the government said, okay, we'll do direct intermediation. We're just going to take the private sector intermediaries out of the market altogether. Okay? And so they signed, that's where the term G2G comes in. Like the World Bank, the migration group has gotten really interested in these arrangements now. Like they're trying to generate more bilateral agreements like this. And so Malaysia says we'll take 36,000 workers, mostly for working in the palm oil sector. So this will be like agricultural workers. And and the rules are the migrant can come, but has to travel alone. You can't come with your family, right? And it's a 2-year contract, right? And unless you get a new work permit, you have to go back after 2 years, right? But it is possible for you to maybe get the work permit renewed by the same employer or by another one. And so here's another piece of evidence on how desperate people are to go. So 36,000 was the announced quota. And so BMET, the Bangladesh Bureau of Manpower, Employment and Training, so they're the ones who are handling it for the Bangladesh government. And so they put in an ad in newspapers saying that there's this G2G agreement, we'll take workers for this 36,000 slot, and 1.43 million people applied. So that's where the lottery came from. Yeah. 100%? Yeah. So actually, no. So yeah, it's going to be like, not that. So I want to answer in 2 parts. So it wasn't that it was restricted to men. The program was not, but because it's outdoor agricultural work, right? It turns out to be. Yeah.
But in general, do you know what percentage? I remember it being on like if you buy it tonight.
Yes. Yeah. So yes. So that varies across the countries in South Asia. So from Bangladesh, it's we're not doing very well with respect to female migration. In terms of Philippines does really well with respect to female migration. So the countries that supply more female migrants, actually India, even though it is mostly men, India actually supplies more than others do. Yeah. So often, they're domestic workers. Yeah. But Philippines, the Philippines actually does. Philippines is like is a model country with respect to female migration, in the sense that they now have training programs for various skill levels. So nurses, physical therapists. In fact, I think I suspect even in Providence, if you go to a physical therapy place, you'll find Filipina physical therapists. Like there's lots of healthcare workers. Yeah.
Did they ever explain to you why they wanted migrants to come alone?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's cheaper. So they want that's the
purely economic reason. There's a serious historical politics here.
Oh yeah, what do you think? What do you think it is?
So Mushfiq, I worked in Malaysia a lot. It's one of the countries I worked in, and it's part of my multi-country project on ethnicity. Malaysia, under the British, Malaya then, before Singapore broke away, allowed a lot of Chinese to come in and a lot of Indians to come in. By the time the British left, the Chinese were 33% of the population, and Indians were about 10% of the population.
Mostly Tamil.
Mostly Tamil. And they settled down there.
Yeah.
The question for Malays was, if 35% of the population is Chinese and 10% is Indian, and at least half of those Indians are very rich, and 2/3 of Chinese are very rich, what happens to politics?
Bhumiputra politics.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
So then the whole business, in fact, they were not willing to give the Chinese citizenship for a long time.
Yeah.
Right. And the Indians, so Indians were less problematic because they were only 10%. Chinese were every third Malaysian was a Chinese.
Right.
And that migration began in 1850s and they never went back to Canton.
Yeah.
That's the background here.
Yeah.
And so that part of Malaysian politics I have studied.
Yeah, absolutely.
This fear of numbers.
Yes. So yeah, that makes perfect sense that Malaysia wouldn't even think about, like, you know, you wouldn't want even like you, and again, this may be the gender question too. You might also not want any person in Malaysia who might have a child, right?
Correct.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, so now so many people applied. So this is where the randomized control trial happened. The government ran it, which is that we needed to select 36,000. So they ran a lottery, and I want to explain the structure of this two-part lottery. Okay, so the first part of the lottery was you have to select 36,000 names. Okay, so they did. It was a pretty simple lottery, except that they wanted they wanted to make sure that there was representation from around the country. Otherwise, like given the population of Dhaka, then a lot of the visas would go to people who reside in and around Dhaka, right? So they just had BUET, the University of Engineering and Technology, run the lottery, but they had it stratified so that there were quotas by district. Okay, and then once they ran the first lottery, so people are notified that you won the lottery, so you have a high chance of migration. And the next step of the process is BMET set up offices in many districts around the country where you'd have to go in and do your paperwork that Malaysia needed, right? The process is that we're going to collect the paperwork. So this is the intermediation they're doing. We're going to test some of the things that they want. For example, one of the restrictions was, so there was height and weight, right? So you measure height and weight, you take a photograph, right? And then Malaysia said, we need people who can lift like 20 kg, I think. Okay, so they had a 20 kg thing, and so people had to come in and lift it. Okay, so that was the test. And then there was like later on recommendations for like, oh, we want some people to be trained in like have basic language skills, etc. But that comes later after. So then, okay, so people go in and do this and sort of build their dossier that Bangladesh can send. And then there's a second lottery, which is Malaysia said, okay, 36,000 total, but we're going to do this in phases. We're going to first take 10,000, right? So then there's a second lottery, which is let's select the high likelihood 10,000, the people who are going to be intermediated first. Okay? And so then we end up having three groups here, right? Which is people who lost the lottery, the control group, people who won that first lottery, right? But then people who won both the lotteries. Okay. So T1 is going to be people who won both the lotteries because they're the ones who have the highest likelihood of migration. And I'll show that in the data too. Right. What was nice about the second, I mean, nice for research, but not for them, about the people, the 26,000 who did not win the second lottery, but won the first, is that, so they suddenly have a higher likelihood of migrating, but it never comes true, right? For most of them, because Malaysia decides after 10,000, they're not going to take anymore. Okay. So now you have a group of people who sort of had enhanced beliefs that they would migrate, but didn't actually get to migrate. So you could use that. So my idea here was, let's use that to study how people react in terms of making investments, right? If you have a higher chance of migration, but you don't actually do it.
How many people actually, like, did everyone effectively pass the test, or of the 36,000 candidates, like how many put the thing or were falling out?
Oh yeah, so I don't have that data, but it was like like when speaking to BMET, that wasn't a big deal, right? Because the requirements were so so minimal, right? I mean, it wasn't even literacy, right? So so that wasn't really a big issue. Yeah. Oh, and in fact, I can. So something that I did while I was like trying to get them to share the lottery information with me, because our activity was basically what I do is I take the lottery information. So in government computers, there was information on who won the lottery, who lost the lottery, everybody who participated, because who did this. So we got those files, and then we tried to track them down. Okay, so our job was just like try to find a random sample of these people to interview. And I'll talk a little bit about that because, of course, finding rates might vary by treatment group, et cetera. So we need to do some work on that. Now, so in the process, like while I'm trying to convince them to give me the data, I was also trying to figure, okay, what can I do for you that would be helpful, right? So the government bureaucrats there at BMAT, they were saying, oh, we're sending these names, right? And then they send back a bunch of visas. And I don't know why some people are getting chosen first, okay? So then I was like, okay, let me run those regressions, right? So we tried to figure that out, including, okay, what information did you send them? We get the universe of the information, like height, weight, etc. Right? Those things don't really have much predictive power. I was like, okay, so they send a photograph. I was like, oh, maybe they're doing some kind of, I don't know, eugenics on the on the photograph. So then we started. So I hired a AI person to like measure the symmetry in people's faces, the distance between their eyebrows, right? And it turns out you can't really explain why the Malaysians are choosing some people versus others. So like some employer, the way it was working on that side is that it goes to the government gives it to the various plantations, right? And they said, oh, we want these people, and then they send the visas, right? And there was nothing sort of observable, at least in the data that was being sent. And with like even with machine learning, there was nothing that we could really figure out what was working.
Sorry, wait, so even amongst the 10,000 who won the second lottery, then those people picked their the percentage, the patient orders that they got.
Yeah.
Those are people who like were chosen.
Yeah, or they were chosen later. So what? Yeah, so it was more often like they sent a batch of like 150 visas, right? Even though 1,000 names were sent, the first 150 get to migrate, and then another 150 like a month later. Like it was just a slow process. So you'll see that I'll show you the numbers. So 76% of the people who won the lottery, right, ultimately get to migrate, right, are observed in Malaysia. Now, part of it is, I mean, it's not that 24% weren't chosen. Like a lot of them just, we didn't go all the way down to 10,000. We only went down to like something like 8,500.
Yeah. It's kind of remarkable that height and weight was not. If I was randomly thinking, I'm going to do work on my farm.
Yeah, right. And it didn't have much predictive power. Okay, so then, all right. So now, in terms of interpreting the results, so I'm going to show you virtually everything I show you will be intent to treat. Okay, which is if you win this lottery, there's a 76% chance that you'll get to migrate. And in the control group, of course, even if you lost the lottery, those people can find a way to migrate. Often they'll migrate elsewhere, not to Malaysia, right? So then the intent to treat will give us the differences in outcomes between like a 76% migration rate versus a 20%. Okay, and so here's just the bottom line. I'm going to go through each of these bins slowly, but what we observe is very large increases in income of the migrant, like the person or the lot, I should say, not the migrant, but the lottery participant. Okay, the lottery participant relative to like lottery winners relative to lottery losers basically triple their income. Okay, and that leads to overall a doubling of household income. Household consumption goes up. These are just indices, which leads to investments in children, some pretty large reduction in poverty, but I'll also talk about exactly who was participating here. And there's some moments of poverty that go down a lot, but not others, and I'll explain why. But one, and then given that it's men who leave, as we were just talking about, so you see that women start making more decisions, but we'll come back and talk about like, under what family structures do women actually start getting to make more decisions or not? And there is not much displacement of other household members' incomes, right? So even though this guy's earning a lot more, it's not like everybody else is sitting at home. So essentially, not much of a spillover effect, either for any adults or women. Okay, and then one outcome that was interesting here that's doesn't go in the same direction as everything else is that entrepreneurship goes down, so the rate of like starting businesses, etc. Right? And here the answer turns out to be very simple. The person who participates in the lottery, right? They are the most entrepreneurial person. Yeah. They leave, and so businesses at home don't get started. right? And if you were to, so one thing we can't see yet is whether the person accumulates assets, savings in Malaysia, which leads to a larger business being started up later. That seems to be a typical story, but we don't yet have the long enough time period to see that. So, but we are planning to do a follow-up to look for that. Yeah.
That's the investment of children. Do you have on the rate at which children are working?
Yes, and there's no, yeah, we actually looked at child labor specifically, or age labor by age groups. Yeah, no, there's no change.
Right, when you say housing gap, is that, are you including the income of the migrant or only the remittances of the migrant?
No, it's income. Yeah, so this is going to be everybody. I'll have a.
Like I make a lot of money in Malaysia, but then I spend it all on whatever. Does that kind of increase household income, or are you only?
Okay. Yeah. So don't worry about this one, because this is an index across like 8 measures. I'm gonna get to a slide which has that broken down.
While they are abroad.
So while most, I mean, when we interviewed them, it was a mix. So there are some, so we interviewed them after more than 2 years after the initial travel, right? Which means that the initial contract had expired, but a lot of the people, even after the initial contract, they were able to renew. So many of those people had stayed back. So I think it was, I can't remember the exact fractions, but like about half were still abroad, about half not.
So these story meets about remittances and any skills they gain and were able to
Bring, yeah, but then when you look at different sources of income, right, you see that it's the remittance income that really dominates. So most of this is coming from the fact that people are still abroad and sending a lot of money back. Yeah, and then, I mean, when initially I started with many different types of migration experiences, right? The fact that your immediate family is being left behind, right? That leads to a lot of the money that they're earning being remitted, right? But other types of migration where you get to take your family and your extended family is left behind, of course, the remittance patterns look very, very different. So that was actually the case for one of those Pacific Island studies where you travel with your family. Once you travel with your family, what David McKenzie and Quadis find is that the extended family actually do worse back home. Okay, there is the simple question of the returns to migration has a very long history, a lot of literature behind it. So this is, I put in whatever I could fit on one slide, but there's many more papers. But so I'm going to go by category as opposed to paper by paper. So a lot of this literature is animated by the fact that there is obvious selection issues with migration, right? Which is the set of people who choose to go or who are able to go may be very different from people who don't. And therefore, if I see that those families are doing differentially well, I don't have a good counterfactual. They might have been doing well even if they stayed at home. So then there are a variety of techniques like matching and instrumental variables, right? Using networks at the destination, et cetera, that people have tried in order to get some estimates of returns. And then variation in immigration policies, right? And then this is a case, so this would be one of the best published ones more recently. So this is Filipino migrants in Korea, right? And what's the discontinuity? It's that one of the requirements was that you have to be able to pass a Korean language test, right? So they look at Filipinos who are in Filipinas who just passed the test versus just failed. And then these are the papers from the South Pacific using lotteries. But New Zealand takes like 300, 400 people. So that's a very different scenario. Okay, so what we are going to be focused on is low-skilled, temporary international migration. All right, so we've actually I've already told you all this. So, it was explicitly male, sorry. 5 feet. Yeah, that's right. I am not a representative Bangladeshi in that dimension. Age between 18 to 45, weighs at least 50 kilograms, and you have 20 kg. I got that right. Okay, so we've told this story. Like a lot of people applied. They had to run a lottery, registration done at the union level, and then there was a second lottery. Okay, So this is going to be the design. Right? So we have the initial registration was 1.43 million people who participate in the lottery. And so we sampled 3,500. And of course, we massively oversampled the winners, right? Half of our sample, or more than half of our sample actually come from the 36,000 who won. And why more than half? Because we were trying to get both the people who won both lotteries as well as a single lottery, right? And then of the 1.4 million, we sampled 1,200 people over there. And then within the winners, there's the phase 1 winners, the people who got really lucky, won both, right? A third of our sample come from that, and a third from people who had deferred intermediation. Okay, and then, well, what is this representative of? So like if you wanted to do something representative of this population, you'd have to go travel all over the country and find these applicants wherever they are, right? But we instead decided to focus on the 3 of the most populous divisions in Bangladesh, just because survey costs were going to be a little bit lower there. So Dhaka, Moimonching, and Chittagong division, okay? Which covers about half the country in terms of population. But just bear in mind that Dhaka, Moimonching, and Chittagong are, because the 2 major cities are there, the major port and the capital cities there, it's going to be relatively more prosperous than the rest of the country. Okay, so now so this is something that maybe later on I'll come back and spend some time on, which is econometrically, you might worry about differential selection or attrition, like differential finding rates for treatment versus control. And the reason is that even starting out, we knew this, that because of some quirk in whose computer at BMed things were saved in, for the control group, we started out with better information, right? We had 100% of phone numbers for the people who actually lost the lotteries, which is weird. It was literally that, like, this guy's computer like had a virus or something. So that's why we couldn't get the. So now we had phone numbers for not many of the T2, a lot of the T1, but everybody in the control group. Okay, so then we were actually worried that we'd have trouble finding the winners, right? Also because they might have migrated, right? So we did, we had in mind, for the wrong reason, put in effort, and we're going to use that effort to like generate some bounds. But it turns out once you go to the field, it turns out it's really, really easy to find the winners. It's hard to find the control.
Just look for the big houses.
Yeah, or because, yeah. Right, but it's actually not literally, that is funny, but it's not literally the big houses. It's because, like, it turns out, like, once you win, then you have to do registration and paperwork. So basically, there was a lot more touch points with the local leaders, right? So everybody knew who they were, and also, it's also the case that if you get to travel internationally, you're a hero, right? So people. Do something else, yeah. So once we started, like, once we're in the field, we start saying that, okay, we're finding these are very high rates and not those. But then we had phone numbers, so we called over and over. So we have like very good records of the effort we put in. And there was this very nice paper by Luke Behagel and others on sort of limiting the Lee bounds, right, on the basis of differential effort. So we end up implementing that on the basis of the number of phone calls that we make. So it turns out our effect sizes that I showed you are so large and clear, right, that these things, like, thinking about these things don't matter too much. So I'm not going to bother with it as I present the results to everybody. But towards the end, I can come and show you. Like, it turns out it's even Lee bounds, which penalize you a lot for being really good at finding the treatment group, right? It's a really odd procedure once I started implementing it. Like, if you actually do worse in finding a group, then you do better with the Lee bounds. But if you do really well in one group, you get huge penalties, right? So it doesn't, I mean, in our case, the effect size are so large, it ends up not mattering too much. But the other thing that I'll have to worry about, that I'll just point out to all the economists in the room, that given that, I was looking at a very large number of outcomes, right? Of course, you have to worry about multiple hypotheses hypothesis testing and correction of standard errors for that. So everything I'll show you, I won't bother with it, like have slides on it, but everything I show you will be the family-wise error correction rate. And I'll also show you indexes so that we like rather than having, so we have 8 different measures of household income in order to answer the type of question you were asking, right? But we can also create an index and again, the effect sizes are too large for these things to matter. Okay, so what do we, and now we can start looking at results. Right? Okay, so here are our finding rates. So what we end up getting is overall, the finding rate for T1 was really high, 94%, and we get roughly 69 or 68% of the 2 other groups. Okay, and then we did, try over and over, especially for these groups, right? And kept logs of how often we were trying, how many phone calls were made. So now, in terms of what I show you, will be the intent to treat specifications. I won't actually even show you any regression columns. I'll just show you some pictures, graphs. So, but it's going to be as simple as running the outcomes on whether the lottery outcome. That's it. Okay, so the first one is migration rate itself. Okay, so T1 is the group that got very lucky, right? Won both lotteries. So you see the 76% of them get to migrate. Now in the control group, about 18% do. Okay? So, and then if you look at whether or not there was G2G intermediate and migration, right? You see virtually almost all the treatment group migrants did go in this form. It's not like they were going to they didn't like the fact that they didn't like the Malaysia option and they went somewhere else. Right. They mostly went here. And then one of the main reasons is that this is much cheaper than just traveling alone, right? So when we look at, and this is something to bear in mind when we come back and look at the poverty effects. So another thing that this program does is that it allows people who used to be not rich enough to migrate, not to be able to, so because the cost of intermediation averages around like $4,000 or $5,000. Okay, so that's a lot of money. Whereas the fees in the G2G agreement was like 1/10 as much. It was an order of magnitude smaller. Okay, that's me. I'm going to turn that off.
Were you surprised or not that the E2, there should be no really big difference in the control and in terms of their outcome.
Oh no, so actually, so I should, exactly. So it turns out, so if you see the extra migration rate here, right? The excess here is all G2G intermediated. So it turns out that some of the names from T2 did get sent, right? But a very small amount, right? And they were able to go. So the reason why we collected this data and allocated 1/3 of my samples to these guys, is that I was thinking that what would happen is, once I heard the story, that these guys would just have 0 here, right? And so then I would then I could then say, oh, you know what? This extra migration is the effect of making some pre-migration investments, right? Just on the basis of a promise of migration, right? But I can't make that statement anymore because it turns out some of these names slipped in, right? In fact, we know exactly the 10% is the extra migration. So it turns out it's not a very useful group, right? So in some sense, if I were to do it over now that I know what happened with the T2 guys, right, which I didn't get a clear story from BMET early on, is that I wouldn't waste so much of my sample on these guys because they were essentially like control, just a messy control.
So how was the data after that?
Why did they? No, so they Bangladesh did start. So Malaysia, by the time that Malaysia said, no, we're not going to take any more through this program. So they just halted the program, right? like more than 10,000 of these names did get processed, right? So what they did was, we divided things up into phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. All of phase 1 got processed. Phase 2 got processed as well, right? And then that's how some of the names. It's just that most of them did not get processed, and that's why they didn't go. So it got halted. So instead of being halted as soon as phase 1 ends, so imagine it got halted at phase 1.1. Okay, so almost everybody who goes through this program because it's much cheaper. Okay, and so that also tells us something about the extensive margin here, which is a different type of person is getting to migrate to this program. So when we think about the effects of G2G in particular, right? And then, this answers the question you were asking, Danny, before. So of the 76% who moved, 57% were still abroad at the time of our survey. And this time of our survey was roughly 4.5 years after the initial lottery. Okay? So they had been, so more than half the people were able to renew their contract not once, but maybe twice. Okay. All right, so this is the income, and it might be, this is household income, and it doubles due to remittance income. So this might help us answer one of the questions you were asking. So the largest effects that we see are exactly the migrant, right? So remittance income more than triples. And then labor income earned away, which is basically very similar to this, right? So amount that you are earning outside the home, right? Those are the numbers that are very, very high, right? And then you see a big drop, but not as large, drop in labor income earned at home. And the reason is this is a person who would have otherwise earned income at home, right? So this is not making up for the fact that there was a large income shock. And not much. Okay, so non-farm business. So this is going to also show up in the lower entrepreneurship, right? So what these guys would have done would be engaged in labor or a little bit in running their own businesses, right? Then nothing's happening to farm income or other types of rental income. So all of this put together means that total income at home is available at home is going up, and total income from all sources is roughly doubling. All right, I can't see what this is. Migrant income, go up threefold. So now this is for the migrant income. We're just looking at, what are the different categories, for the lottery applicant, what are the different categories of income? And what they're really earning is exactly what they were earning more of, is exactly what they were hired to do, which is do wage work abroad. Okay?
What are they doing at home? Do they have home corrected farms? Are they like a spot agricultural market?
Yeah, so these are okay. So so let's talk about the population a little bit. Yeah, so our sampling is coming from rural areas, right? So this is mostly agrarian areas, right? And then no, you shouldn't be thinking of these guys as like the pure landless laborers, because even the families that can afford $600 of intermediation fees will knock out like the bottom 40% of the population, right? So basically, the people who are landless, they're not participating in the lottery at all, right? So imagine that. So normally, so imagine I have a spectrum of income, high income over here, right? So of course, rich people don't migrate for work like this, for this kind of low skill work. So a lot of people over here are normally would be, paying private sector intermediation and migrating. And that's, we're just extending that a little bit, but there's also a lot of population that we're still not doing it before.
I'm just trying to understand in terms of their farming. If you were sort of a land laborer, if you own land and then grow rice or whatever you're growing, either way, like things at least for practice here that maybe kids would work more.
Yeah. So so this particular population, you should be thinking of them as like they are managing farms, right? So they have land and they're having to manage the fact that they hire some labor, right? And then sometimes these guys are also running local businesses, which could be like a tea stall, a small shop in the village selling stuff, that kind of.
But you don't see any of the, like, for instance, subsidies that are offered over.
No, so we'll look at that. We'll have another table looking at that. It turns out not. Yeah. Oh, there it is. So essentially, yeah, all the so this is excluding the person who applied for the lottery. So what is it? What is happening to other household members? Right? There's really no change, no statistically significant change in their in how they're spending their time. Right?
You guys have been pretty good about our labor and fees and customers and leading.
Yeah, so because weeding tasks, if you can avoid it, you wouldn't do it, right? So you have more money, and I guess you might be hiring that. But the other thing that might be going on here is that there are two opposing effects, right? So one is that, like, there's an income effect, right? So I don't need to work as much, right? But on the other hand, you're also now you have assets that you could possibly earn a return on, right? And that's why it makes sense to put effort into certain markets. Right?
Or you may be more productive.
Sorry?
Or you may be more productive.
Productive, yeah.
Low nutrition.
Exactly, yeah, and we'll see that in a second. Yeah. Which is coming right here. So you see overall small increases in food consumption, but much larger increases in non-food expenditures. Okay? So this is also coming from the fact that these are not the poorest of the poor. So in all the migration, the internal migration work I did, that's really this last bit of the people, people who are landless. In fact, explicitly, our target was landless laborers for encouraging internal migration. And there, the effects that you see in those families are all about food. So people spend a lot more of their money on food. So over here, it's about non-food expenditures, but within food, you do see significant increases in protein consumption. Right? So people are increasing the quality of the food that they eat. Right? There is a pretty significant sizable effect on education expenditures. So there's some investments in kids, right? And we also collected data on things that we wouldn't want them to necessarily spend money on, like tobacco. There's no significant change in tobacco expenditures. Okay, and here's what's happening to the poverty rate, like at these three different lines, right? So when you're looking at the higher poverty rate at $550 per day, there's a pretty significant reduction, 18% reduction on people living on $550 a day, but there is no reduction on people living on $190 a day, right? So, and this is because I think the $600 intermediation fee just excludes this population.
And do you think it was fertility?
Fertility?
Yeah, we just sort of put away for.
Yeah. Oh, so we look at it. Yes, it is much harder. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Yeah. So actually, we do. Okay. So I'm not. Yeah. So let me talk about it because I'm not sure if I have that slide up. So but there's a section on this on the paper. It seems to pause some demographic changes, right? So not only fertility, the other thing that happens is the delays in marriage, also because it's harder, right? So of course, a lot of the migrants were married by the time they went, right? So exactly, they don't get married for those 2 years, right? So, and then when they don't get married, partly because they don't get married, or also because they're away, right? You see that family, like, you're less likely to have new household members appear. Right? So, so there is this pause in demography. I don't know if that will lead to, if that would just be made up by excess fertility later, right? We don't know yet. But it could be that they're at an age group where actually, if you delay it, maybe that actually leads to like some fraction less per kid.
So do your expenses and your income add up?
No, not expenses, and because we're also going to look at investments. So people buy houses. So the big house comment you made. Yeah.
They buy houses, they expand houses. I don't know how well you measure.
Yes, actually, it's expand. No, it's mostly expansion. It's not buy. Yeah. So it's like adding another. Yeah. So we did look at, like, we have separate questions for that. I guess anybody who grew up in Bangladesh would know to ask about that. And you see that, like, adding floors to your homestead, that's the type of thing that happens most often. But there is some buying of land, and they become also less likely to sell land. Right? So net land position improves because we move in both directions. Oh, by the way, why are they less likely to sell land? That might have happened at the time of the decision, right? And the reason is that if you're trying to migrate to Saudi Arabia and you need $5,000, the way you do it is you sell land, right? And so these guys, when they win the lottery, they're not having to do that. Right. So
they're also much less likely to sort of short-term risk, right? Sure.
Sorry,
sort of-
say,
a lot of land sales are associated with distress,
yeah,
right? And
Yeah.
they're not
And
going to be in distress.
that's
in
exactly,
the same way
yeah,
because they have
that's right.
insurance.
that's right. Oh, you know what? So something that Judy Chevalier was telling me. So we were like, before we started the talk, I was having a conversation about our surgical mass versus cloth mass, right? And Andy and I were discussing, yes, I don't have precise enough data to be able to say that this mask is definitely better than that
Than
mask.
mine.
It just looks
But
better,
mine's prettier.
Right, it's prettier. But then something that Judy told me, so she's teaching right now. So she says that the students who wear the fabric mask, like half of their words like get eaten up by the mask, like she can't understand them. So it
Yeah.
turns out it's not so much about,
Yeah, once I was
Help.
suggesting. Right?
so yeah, so this is like the filtration is much better also in terms of like words coming through.
Yeah.
So I'm having harder time understanding. So.
Yeah, but I can project. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So so here's the real estate numbers. So both bought and sold go in opposite directions, and people seem to be making some large expenditures per capita. Yeah. So once you so to answer your question, so not just this consumption, but once you also look at this plus the investment plus debt, right? So these guys are also making more loans. I think I have it somewhere here. Yeah. Okay. They are less likely to have any outstanding loans. Sorry, no, that's not true. Okay, so here's they're less likely to have any loan, right? 9 percentage points less likely, and they are more likely to have. This is not much. This is not a big effect, but this is a positive coefficient on lending to other people. But and also the distress point, like you just ask them a question, could you easily get 6,300 taka? They're much more likely to say yes.
So on the real estate, one question that occurs to me is
Oh, real estate, yeah.
if the control group is not, you're just saying that some people, when they decide to migrate, they will sell the real estate to afford migrate. So that seems like it's not happening.
Yeah, so sorry, yeah, so in the what I was saying is in the control group, sorry, I didn't understand fully, but in the control group, so people would have had to maybe sell real estate in order to finance a trip.
And they're not, because otherwise.
Well, that's the.
I mean,
Yeah, there's a tiny effect there, but yeah, but
so why do
yeah.
you think that why is this control group not making a bigger effort to migrate? Because
Yeah.
the whole group is not self-selected into one.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So even in that control group, we see 20% migration rate, right? Now, note that. Okay, so that's a good question. So I'm just trying to think through what the explanation might be. So that control group is now made up of people who generally want to migrate, right? That's always been true. So they would participate in the lottery. But also we now know a lot of new people, like who are extremely poor, who got induced to participate in this lottery because they heard that this only takes $500 instead of $5,000. Right? Now the thing is that for them, $500 is the only ticket out. Right? So if they lose the lottery, there's nothing else they can do. Right? So then that 20%, you should see that 20% is coming from the subset of people who could, so it's like, yeah, 20% of a smaller denominator. Right? Okay, and then for educational expenditures, we actually looked at overall educational expenditures go up, as we saw, but then we looked at exactly what's happening to kids. So yeah, educational expenditures going up, and you see little things like small effects or nil effects on like uniform or private tutor, right, or having a school bag, etc. So yeah, works the wage actually goes down. So somebody, yeah, but this is actually, yeah, well, it's 2%, 2 percentage points. Baseline is really small, so the 2 percentage point is actually a pretty large percent change, right? But this is generally not in rural Bangladesh these days. This is generally not a big problem, right? And the reason is that the type of wage work that they could do, like at say manufacturing facilities, right, factories. So those, garment factories. So they are very, especially with the Nike, those Nike cases in the 1990s. That's the one thing that they look out for very carefully, because Walmart, H&M, etc.
Yeah.
They don't ever want
They don't like that.
a big news item, right?
But also
Okay.
schooling up to primary is almost as universal, pretty much.
Yeah, that's
So
right.
it would only be just.
That's right. Both boys and girls now. Yeah. Yeah.
On that slide, is there any evidence that people who, are in the treatment group maybe are like, using the money to save up for like a big ticket purchase, or they're using that income to like,
Yeah.
leverage more debt?
Yeah, we do see quite a large increase in large expenditures.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, 172% of the.
Do you know what those are? Is it real estate? Is it
So-
livestock? Is it?
I think I'm not sure if you have that
Washing
detail.
machines.
It's definitely not that.
No, it's our refrigerators, right? It's gotta be.
Yeah. Freight,
Yeah,
yes.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm not sure if you have that detail. So I'm going to hazard a guess, and I might not have the data to back this up. Right? I think I suspect if I had to rank them, I suspect the number one thing would be like a housing asset, which could either be land or a building, right, or both. And the reason that would be my first guess is that that's the main vehicle for savings, right, and that's the main attribute of wealth in rural Bangladesh. Yeah, and one reason is that we're not really collecting property taxes, so it's a good way to store your wealth. And then after that, I would say they're probably like the migrant, something we would not yet observe, right? Because typically the typical story, and I'm telling you these typical stories because like this is the story of my family and how like we got out of poverty was you go work in another place for a while, you accumulate some like really cash savings, and you bring that back, and then you start some business, which could be a store selling stuff or.
Right, but like that period of time hasn't yet been observed for this sample?
Yeah, it's just like 4.5 years after they left. Like that normally comes like 10-15 years later. Okay. Oh yeah, so we were talking about exactly like hiring workers. So the one thing that we see is, the non-farm business is going down. I think this is just the selection effect of who migrates. Right? But yeah, hired workers for crop, no, there's no increase. So they're actually not doing any more farming. Right?
It's a little bit weird. I mean, not that they do, but like if your main laborer leaves and you're doing roughly the same amount of crops.
Yeah, then you think that this should go up, right? There's some, yeah. Do we have any capital? I was also thinking about, okay, does this come with substitution of labor for capital or something like that?
Yeah,
If we don't have anything.
yeah, I don't know how you got like transferred family labor. Because you wouldn't necessarily pick that up in the household and you wouldn't pick that up as expenditure, but your brother
okay.
would come and do a lot of work.
For you. Okay. Yeah, we wouldn't. Yeah, we didn't think to ask about this.
No.
Yeah, I agree that this is weird. Like, how can this happen when and not this going up? Yeah, and so this is the one that we asked the question because we thought that was going to be over here.
They're completely different crops, right? That they work in Malaysia.
Oh yeah. It's Malaysia. It's a plantation. It's a totally different production structure. Yeah, and also a different crop, palm oil.
There's no learning.
I mean, it's possible. It's possible that you learn about capital, right? Yeah, but like I don't have any direct evidence that they are learning something about capital that they're starting to use. Now, the type of capital that you would use in a plantation, like it's a different scale, but like maybe you get used to the idea of operating a machine, which might make it easier for you to do it, right? But
You could learn something about pesticides and stuff.
pesticides, yeah, that's true. Okay, so what's going on? Okay, so this is what we talked about earlier, changes in household composition. So what you're seeing is a reduction in the probability that there's a new household member since you left, right? So this is basically not having kids, right? You're less likely to also have split. Okay, what does split mean? It's, there's an extended family, and then the younger couple would move out and split. But what's going on is that since the husband isn't there, right? The extended family is more likely to stay together. That's what this is. So you're less likely to be married, right? The number of children, actually, there's no significant effect on negative coefficient. There's no effect on the elderly. Now, who's the household head? There's a 38% reduction, 38 percentage point reduction that the applicant would be the household head, and it's being taken up by the wife and a little bit by a parent. Okay. Okay, so that's in terms of demography, what's going on is you're not getting married, you're not having kids, and the wife is now the husband. So that should lead to some changes in female decision making. So then we use the standard questions on like female decision making power, on like, is the woman involved in all matters? Is it only the woman who makes those decisions versus a combined man and a woman, right? So you do everything you're saying that, let's say the index of female decision making is going up by half a standard deviation. Okay. So now what's interesting about this though, is like, okay, there are different types of families here, right? So sometimes it's essentially the nuclear family where the husband leaves and the wife is there and she's making decisions. But in other cases, an extended family where the father-in-law is still present, right? So then we run these regressions. So this is non-experimental, right? What we're doing is looking at the increase in female decision-making power, right? But looking at the interaction term with whether or not the applicant is married, or the applicant's father is still alive, or whether the father still resides in the household. So what you see is that, okay, so with migration, the female decision-making improves, but not at all in families where the applicant's father is still in the household. So basically there's like a hierarchy here where the applicant would be the household head, right? If he's not there, the elderly father is, right? And when he's not there, then his wife becomes the household head, right? And makes decisions. Okay, so now finally, we'll talk a little bit about what happens with the pre-migration investments. And here I start bringing in T2. The guys who thought they could migrate, but many of them couldn't, right? And so these dots, you can't see it behind the Zoom screen, but the lighter colors, are sorry.
The mouse is there if you want to click that, make that go away.
Okay, it's fine. So the lighter colors are the T2. Okay, so what you see is that the T1 group, the people who actually migrated, they had a large effect on learning a foreign language, right? And what did they learn? Malay. Okay. And then for T2, they also learn Malay. So this is, I think, also being driven by the small subset of the T2 group that we're actually going. There's no effect on any other language, English, Arabic, etc. Okay. And then the other effect that you see is like taking a skills training. The reason why, like, okay, these are interesting to observe, but they're not that exciting in the sense that by the letter of the law, these were requirements. So after you win the lottery and you get the chance to migrate, then Malaysia says, so now you need to do two things. So take skills training and learn basics of the Malay language. And so that's what you observe people doing. Okay. But here, these are the things that are sort of not required, but you see effects on, that people start eating more after they win the lottery. Okay. Even before they travel, and they eat more protein and they do more exercise. Okay, this is a weird variable for Bangladesh context, but yeah, there's no effect on gym memberships. Right? So, and we already know that even when people take gym memberships, not that anything changes.
Would you I mean,
Yeah.
no way to answer this, but like I would assume that the aliens are having to go in and measure and weight and lift something out. Even if you pass, if you have some sense of like, oh man.
Yeah, did they learn something about themselves?
Yeah, or like
Yeah.
there's just some salience to it. Like, oh, in order to migrate, you
Yeah.
like lift heavy things.
Yeah, it's
Maybe there's more to do.
yeah, I like that story. So that could happen. And a closely related story I would tell is that once if they are asking you, if that's the only thing that you're asked to do as your test, right?
Yeah.
Then you'll start thinking, oh man, I'm gonna have to do a lot of this.
Yeah, it's
So,
definitely a lot heavier.
yeah. And therefore it makes sense for me to invest in this. Yeah. Yeah, I can't tell which is which, but I like your story. All right, so then I'm gonna skip over this. My co-author did this. I think it's endogenous. I don't want to talk about it. Yeah, I need to take it out. Okay, so one final thing I'll show you is what happened in the COVID period, right? So this, even though I just showed you that, these migrants were doing a lot better, right? They were like the household income more than double, right? But it was also a risky thing for COVID, which is that the T1 group, right, were significantly more likely to report, like when we resurveyed them in April 2020, right after COVID hit, they were significantly more likely to report that they had zero income. Okay? So these, because one of the first, for two reasons. So early on in the pandemic, right, before the virus actually entered Bangladesh and was widespread in Bangladesh, our country was already affected for two reasons. So one is that migration remittances are important, and several other countries that we send migrants to, Italy, Singapore, right, Malaysia, were already hit. Okay. And the second reason was that like all the garment orders had dried up right away, right? And so these migrant families were differentially more likely to suffer early in the pandemic. Okay. And so we actually, I saw this not only in this particular sample, but we have other, the internal migrant sample in Bangladesh, and you see similar patterns that when you were reliant on remittances and like mobility-based income, those guys suffered more early. Okay, so that's the paper. So let me just conclude. So as I've already told you the behavioral story, exactly how you do the trimming and then the lead bounds. So given that we had like a 200% effect on income, it turns out that even when we trim, it doesn't, the effect doesn't really go away. What else? Okay, that's actually all I have.
How does it correspond with sort of McKinsey's estimates and so forth?
Yeah. So McKinsey has multiple papers, right? So in the paper where there's two types of papers. So in one case, the migrant travels with his immediate family, right? And then you look at, and then they actually find negative effects there, right? And then the other case is where the migrant travels alone, right? And there they find positive effects, and not as large as what we see in percentage terms, right? And then this is also larger than the effect sizes estimated of the regression discontinuity in Korea. But there, we are talking about that's a much higher scaled type of migration. Okay, so bottom line of the story is that going back all the way to the first set of slides, that we hear a lot about how migration is risky, right? It does, but over here, like what we find is that this particular pattern of movement also contributes a lot to home income and probably to the development trajectories of rural South Asia. And the second thing, those are slides that I should have included that I didn't, is I can show you the non-experimental stuff on kind of what's the experience of migration, right, in Malaysia relative to like the control group migration. So they're non-experimental because I have a table that compares, say, how the migrants are faring at the destination in T1 versus how the migrants are faring in the control group, right? So what you see is that our migrants, this is really, we do this table because we wanted to talk about how the G2G program itself might be different. So our migrants are much more likely to go in with a contract in hand. Okay? I shouldn't say our migrants, G2G migrants are much more likely to go in with contract in hand. They are much more likely to start working, like no waiting period. They go in and they start working and earning wages right away, right? They're much more likely to have days off. Okay, they're also working fewer hours per week. Okay, so the migration experience is a lot better under the G2G program. than under regular migration. Now, the one thing we see a negative effect on relative to like control group migrants is that these migrants to the palm oil plantations, they're more likely to have witnessed a workplace injury. Okay? And I think that comes from, so all the like the injury type, like work, and having to work outside in the sun, so in extreme heat, etc. Right? So those like working conditions wise, it looks a little bit worse than the control group migrants. Okay, and yeah, so why would that be? So there are two explanations of this. So one is just a sector, right? You're going for outdoor agricultural work, which happens to be more dangerous than like household support or providing services indoors, etc. Okay, that's one. And the second thing is that, remember, the control group migrants are going to necessarily, they're a little bit richer, right? So they are going for, like, they're the ones, they're coming from families that can afford a $5,000 trip, right? So they're working on a slightly higher end set of activities. Right? So it's interesting to see, how the G2G migration program does this differently, but I mean, of course, these are non-experimental comparisons, so there are multiple interpretations.
So one of the sort of questions that's emerging kind of this literature is sort of, what is the disutility of not living at home? Right. And, I'm wondering if you had sort of thought in this design whether there was a way to get at that. I mean, some level, at least ex ante, they believe they were better off leaving and making this money, but at some level, that's not the case. And it just seems like, that's emerging as a big question, a lot of the migration literature. So do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, actually, from another paper.
Okay.
So let me explain how we try to get at it in the other work that well, the SEMA migration.
Right, sure.
So, okay, so just a 30-second background is the first paper on SEMA migration was about, like, you run an experiment where you give people subsidies, like transport subsidy travel, and then you check like how their families are doing if they internally migrate before and during the season. And so what we find in that first paper is that when people receive transport subsidies, they're more likely to travel, and when they travel, their families need a lot more, pretty large effect, like 30% increase in food consumption. And then they also choose to go back, right? So what we observe in that paper, okay, this is now I'm going to get to the stability part. So what we observe in that first paper is that about 80% of people are successful. Successful in the sense that they find work, or they report to us they earn as much or more than they expected. The 80% repay the loan. So 80% successful. Okay. And then the second thing we learned in that paper that we made a big deal of is that, look, I run this experiment in 2008. So I pay people to go into the right? And then it's seasonal migration, so they come back. And then 2009, I follow some of them. I don't pay them again. About 50% of the people who were induced choose to go back again. Right? The migration rate, like the first year when I paid them, it was 60 versus 35. The second year was like 48 versus 35. And so then we wrote a model to try and explain why would that be, why did people choose to go back when they weren't originally going. So now when we want to think about disutility, right? So one of the problems, right, why did that paper come about and why we think about disutility is that one of the problems with that original paper is that it's really difficult to explain that behavior. Right? Because the effect sizes are so large that people should have been going, and a $10 transfer should not have made a difference. Right? I've been still working on trying to understand what model can rationalize that behavior fully. So that first paper, like the way we were, the last section of the paper was like, look, we can't really explain.
Very honest.
Yeah, after 75 pages. And so then I've been thinking since then about like, and one answer maybe that there's a lot of this disutility from migration. So it actually shouldn't be that hard to explain, as hard as I made it out, because even though income consumption is going up very lot, that's coming with like some family separation or some bad living conditions in the city. So there's some disutility, so the actual returns to migration are actually not that high, right? And like not as high as the income effect would have you to be, right? So then when you compress that, then it becomes much easier to like have a model that can rationalize it, right? So we pursued that. So the data lab was like, well, we have a paper where we have unmeasured disutility, right? And then we calibrate, so it's a macrosat model, and then we calibrate the model with the experimental parameters. And one of the parameters we calibrate to is the remigration rate. So basically the story there is you know, if 80% of people were successful by my measure, but only 50% are choosing to go back, then that must mean that there's a whole bunch of people I'm characterizing as successful, but like once you think about what they experience, they don't have this. Right? So that's what allows us to like discipline that.
Sure.
That parameter, right? Okay, so we write the model, and so you have this explanation. But then the question is, okay, what is it that is the parameter? That's like I'm saying that's unobserved, but I'm just trying to grasp it. So I ran what do they call them in environmental economics, where you
Hedonic or
no, there's another
willingness to
like
pay
when you
type
run
of-
experiments where you're like
valuation?
discrete choice experiments.
Oh, okay.
DCs. So then what I do is okay. So it's now I'm trying to understand by asking all these migrants, both in treatment control group, okay, what matters to them. Right? So of course, like to run that actual experiment, I would have to change housing conditions for one person, to change family separation for another person, etc. That's going to be way too complicated, expensive. So we actually just do it like in our economy, like we have every migrant answer a series of questions of like option A, option B, right? You have more income, but you have to be away from your family for 4 or 6 weeks at a time. In this case, you have less income, but you can come back every 2 weeks, right? And then in this case, you might have.
So these are sort of scenarios, contingent evaluations. Got it. Okay.
Yeah. So in this case, you go and you have you're in a house with a couple of dreams, right?
Okay.
So you have them answer the questions like from the experiment, but they're not actual experiments.
Yeah, got it.
So then once we do this, then we can then run the model and we'll just figure out what they do on. And it turns out that family separation wasn't such a big deal in that context, right? Which is that because you're like away for 8 weeks at most, right? And whether you come back home in week 4 versus not doesn't seem to matter so much to them. But what matters to them a lot, they're willing to give up a lot of wage for, is bad health conditions. They really dislike the slum area, and you can imagine like you've seen the slum, like people just go in one room with 8 men like living together, right? So people seem to like that's where the disability seems to come from. Like, if you believe this.
Okay, but you didn't do those here.
No.
Good. Anyway, any other questions, comments? Yeah, go ahead, Pat.
I was another, I think, finding from that paper was, if you give the voucher to one person in a village, other people in that village are more likely to migrate as well, right? So I was wondering if you've looked at this context, obviously it's a little different because, it is this G2G program, so there's this barrier on how many people can do it. But I was wondering if you looked at that, and I guess relatedly, like what you think about the ability to scale up programs like this.
Right. Okay. So those are two. I don't know. Questions are so first, I'm glad you read that paper because actually that's different. That's a separate paper. So the original experiment was the one I was describing was just like we did not. I'll just okay. So it was just like individual level randomization, right? In the second time around when we did it to answer spillover questions, then I also randomly varied the saturation of the migration offers. So now you have like you could be in a village where 70% of your friends are getting the offers, and then another person is in a village where only 10% of the friends are getting the offers. So then I can use experimental variation to see if people are more likely to go when a lot of friends are going, right? So that's where you start seeing these spillover effects, right? And it's when it's at a pretty high saturation, right? Whereas, I mean, like a lot of people, and then what you end up seeing is that people actually travel in groups, they're more likely to share accommodation, right? Whereas here, what's going on is it's a nationwide lottery, right? One person's going in like a entire union, right? Entire set of villages. So it's not, so I do think, I mean, at some level it has to be true because if you go to talk to any immigrant taxi driver and you ask them, why are you in Providence? They'll tell you at some point, there'll be some story about how my cousin was here.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's why I ended up here. So it is a network good, like you have to introduce somebody, but I think to pick it up in data like this, you need pretty high saturation. Yeah.
So in your sample, what's the dominant mechanism to explain who renews, who continues contract and who goes back after the first contract?
Oh,
if
that's
it's not distributed, maybe.
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. So we, Yeah, we don't, I'm going to keep that in mind because when we do another round of data collection, I think we should look more seriously at this question of who are the people who returned and who are the people who stayed back. In fact, we have that information here. So I could run a regression to try and figure out like not the initial migration outcome, but the outcome which is like staying past 2 years. Yeah. Okay. I don't have that data, but I don't have that answer right now, but we have the data to be able to run that.
Because I think both positive selection of staying and also negative selection of staying exist, and I don't have any example prior.
Yeah,
So
it could be.
That's true.
It could be either, but I think on net in this context, right? Given how lucrative the migration opportunity is, people are really looking to stay back, right? And so we see more than half the people, like we saw 70% migrated and about 57% were still abroad, even 4.5 years later, right? So vast majority are trying to stay back. And the 13% who come, or the small 13% gap that comes back, I think I should look more carefully at what explains that. Because sometimes what happens is, you see this in Bangladesh too, that like there are, for a minority of people, we see this in internal migration too, but for a minority of people, their skills just don't fare well at the destination. Right? Employers figure that out. Employers like, bye, you don't need to come back. Yeah.
How easy is it first to get rid of these workers again? And how easy is it to replace them with someone from the kind of self-financing route into?
So on the Malaysian side, there's huge demand for migrant income. So that's a country that's experienced enormous wage growth in the last 20 years, right? So if you think about replacement, right, their best subsidy option would be Indonesia. And yes, Malaysia has decided not to really extend this program. So you asked about the scaling of the program. I don't know if the government decided they're not going to continue with it.
Right.
I've never tried experimenting with a scaling program like this because this completely depends on administrative decisions. So the answer to that would be how successful is in Malaysia in managing the flow of Indonesian migrants. That's what determines whether or not they'll have domestic opportunities.
So it'd be interesting. I can't look at it exactly like how you can use the data to think a little bit about the selection of migrants. I feel like migrants are particularly a set of people for whom we think there's this huge omitted variable. There's some candy spirit or whatever we can't measure that make these people sort of better, whether or not they migrate. But you're running a huge treatment effect. And so I don't know, it'd be interesting to know, even from some other data, what if you just did the kind of naive thing comparing migrants to non-migrants, and then maybe you try to control for everything you have to control for.
But we can do that in our control group, right? We have migrants and non-migrants in our control group. And then get a sense of how.
You think about it, maybe you could sort of parameterize and degree of migration or whatever, but it would be interesting. I think you motivate very well if you look you can't really compare things.
Right. So you're so based on
She wants another data set.
Phrase the question. I'm guessing. So tell me if I'm wrong. I'm guessing that you're thinking that generally there's positive selection into migration, and so the naive estimate would be extremely large. And in spite of the fact that my estimate is not naive, I'm still getting a really large number. So
No,
I'm getting the right estimate. They would be.
I would be interested to know what percentage is kind of naive effect or the effect of all control. This seems to be a realm where people feel like the kind of unobserved really good. Maybe it's not.
Actually, I have a paper in the Journal of Monetary Economics that's exactly on this question. Okay, so I'll tell you what that model tells us. Okay, so this is an interesting little piece of the literature on migration. It's like a debate going on between various authors. So what's happening is so this literature starts with this idea that look in what we're observing. So this is a macro phenomenon or macro finding. Macroeconomist finding, which is that you take micro data from 80, 90 different countries. So David Lagakus, Doug Gollin, they did this. and you look at how much do people earn in cities versus rural areas in the same country, okay? Or agricultural wages, non-agricultural wages within the same country. And you find across 80 countries, there's a 350% gap between rural and urban wages. Okay? And you control for various things. You can get it down to like 220%, but still huge. Yeah. So then they call it the agricultural productivity gap or something like that. So that there's a big puzzle. Okay. So now that leads to possibly a puzzle that, look, maybe poor countries are poor because of a lot of spatial misallocation, right? We're like stuck in the wrong, like most unproductive places within those countries, right? And we could generate a lot of growth if you could just move the people to the city. So rather than having a lot of people in Kansas, why don't we like put them in San Francisco? We get a lot more growth that way, right? So okay, so that's kind of animated a lot of this literature, including my experiment. Like, let's see if we can move people. So then some authors wrote this paper, which is like, oh, you know what? That macro paper, that's wrong because it's like cross-sectional comparison. So it could just be that it's all selection, right? Which is in cities, you have people earning more, but they're skilled, right? In rural areas, people don't earn as much, but they don't have the same skills. So then if it's all selection. So if you just move those rural people to, it's not like you get a 350% boost, right? You'll just get, the Kansas person will still earn very little, right? So then the way we're going to solve that problem is, so their solution was, I'm going to run a fixed effects regression. So in two countries, in Kenya and Indonesia, we observe, we have panel data. So sometimes we observe people who are in the rural area, sometimes in the urban area. And then once you run the fixed effects regression, you can re-estimate this, and then they show you get a zero effect. Okay? So this is a case where like it was actually a referee report that turned into a paper, the one. So I was like, so that was, it was actually, exactly this, what you're talking about, which is source of selection and migration, right? So I basically made the point, look, my referee report was this, that in Kenya and Indonesia, the people who are useful for estimating that fixed effects coefficient, they're the movers, right? Yeah. They're only about 5% of the sample, right? And of course, those movers may not have any friction. That in fact, a simple economics model will tell you if somebody doesn't have friction, then in the margin, they should be indifferent between being in the rural urban area. Sometimes they're in the city, sometimes they're in the village, right? And they should have a zero effect. Whereas that doesn't tell us that the 95% of the people don't have friction. So imagine migration costs are high for them, right? Then they might have huge returns to migration and they still choose not to move, right? And so anyways, like the authors didn't like that comment and they wrote the paper and published the paper anyway. And then that's why we wrote the paper. So we write down a model where we say, look, the source of selection can be coming from returns, like you were saying, like the go-getters that would go, and like the people who have the highest returns, they're the ones who would migrate. Because that was the author's response to me, which is that, yeah, you know what? Like it's going to be like if you think about selection, the effects would be even like I guess it would be even larger. In spite of that, we found a zero effect. So our overestimate is still a zero effect, right? But my point was, no, actually you can't tell because it could be coming, the selection could be coming from the cost side or the return side, right? So on the cost side, like it could be that there's a lot of people who would be really great in the city. It's just too costly for them to move, right? So anyway, so that's why I think like our model shows that you can have both over and underestimates. So I don't think we should have any strong priors. And in this particular case, right, you have like, let's say I do the control group thing, right? So I have in my control group, I have migrants, non-migrants, and I can answer your question by comparing them, right? Now, the issue is that, remember that the people who participate in this lottery, right? Some of them were induced to participate because it was only $500. They're like, okay, we can do this, right? But then the people who choose to migrate in the control group, they're the 5,000 people, right? And therefore it could be like, it could go in any direction, right? Like those $500 guys, maybe like really gung-ho people, they just don't have the money to go, right? But they're really talented, right? Or it could be that you really need $5,000 in order to make something of yourself because you need that initial asset.
Yeah. No, I mean, it would just be interesting again, but I don't know that maybe you're saying that this action rating makes it more complicated, but I almost want to see in the table of like
you just want to compare it to the census.
Yeah, or like it's sort of clear, like the Emily and Joe Hunter controls, like the last column is like the actual experimental.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay. Yeah.
To know, like,
Yeah. No, that's a great suggestion, because like I had this literature slide which was about like all these estimates of the returns to migration that come from matching and all that. So it would be nice to be able to say something about like where we expect the non-experimental estimate in this particular case to line up. Yeah. Okay.